Hey everyone, welcome in this Certification Exam Rapid Training or C.E.R.T on AZ-400, Microsoft DevOps Solutions. My name is Peter Detender. I'm an Azure Technical Trainer within Global Microsoft Learning. If you got any questions during the session, feel free to reach out. Even after the session, obviously, don't hesitate reaching out. You can find my email address. If you prefer social media, I'm typically active on Twitter, and I also have a personal blog, 007FFF Learning, where I'm typically sharing some technical blog posts on Azure and every now and then sharing some updates on certification as well. So the reason why you're here is obviously learning about Azure DevOps or focusing more on the core topics of the AZ-400 exam. It's about Microsoft DevOps, which by itself is not exactly the same thing. Now, before diving into the technical details of the exam and more specific, the exam objectives, it's always good to know what is the core idea about my certification, where this one is going to help you in understanding what not only Azure DevOps is all about, but also the broader Microsoft DevOps tooling that we offer, together with an overview of traditional, quite popular third-party tools. And that's mainly what I'm going to cover in the next 60-70 minutes. Helping you in knowing what you need to know for the exam and pointing you into different directions where to find additional learning content, helping you in understanding the core objectives, and from there, obviously, trying to help you in passing the exam. So with that, once more, welcome. And I would say welcome to the fantastic world of DevOps, where DevOps by itself is a union of people, processes, and products, helping to deliver continuous delivery for value to customers. So that's the official definition, not coming from some devops.org or any other open instance. It's actually a definition coming from our own Mr. DevOps, Donovan Brown. And he came up with this definition, and technically what he means by it is that it's not about tooling, it's not about you need to use Microsoft DevOps solutions, it's really about a process, helping organizations in delivering value to a customer. Now, how is this possible? By aligning teams. Easy said, you're going to bring the developer teams together with the operations teams, and to be complete, you're going to add the security teams, you're going to add the project management teams, with the ultimate idea to nicely work together, come up with aligned, streamlined processes, and delivering applications, delivering data center components, repeating the same process over and over, where ultimately it's going to help your business moving forward. Now, the reason you're attending this session or listening to this session in the recording is because you're probably preparing yourself to take the AZ-400 exam, and you want to find out, am I ready? Can I actually pass? Or maybe you're still in the starting phase, and you're actually wondering, what is this exam all about? And is this something I should put on my radar? So the first question is, where do you get started in your preparation? The first recommendation I can give you is read the exam objectives, and I'll show you in a minute where you can find them. Next to that, you need to get hands-on experience, and even better, as much hands-on experience as possible. Understanding what you're doing, which means it's not just clicking through some step-by-step scenarios and succeeding. As long as you follow the instructions, it's probably doable, but you also need to know a bit more than what we're covering in hands-on labs, what we're covering even in our own Microsoft official courseware. So that's where the Microsoft documentation comes in, or any other, I would say, valuable resource, which could be other training courses, which could be product group blog posts, which could be third-party learning content from Pluralsight, even on YouTube, LinkedIn Learning, and so many other resources. And maybe all the way at the end, challenging yourself as well, which means that once you think you really understand the subject, that you're going to test yourself, validating, maybe going through a Microsoft Learn lab module and trying out some new stuff that's not even described in the lab itself. So to help you with some resources, the exam objectives again is one of the most important starting points, because it's going to help you in knowing like what's the exam all about, where can I find reference material, but also what is the core intent of the exam, what are the topics that I need to know, and maybe there are specific components within Azure DevOps or some other Microsoft DevOps tools that might be used in real life, but that we're not seeing showing up on the exam. The hands-on experience, I think that the easiest landing page is our own Microsoft /Learn platform. And we also have a subset of that called Azure DevOps Labs. It's a landing page where you can find about 25, maybe close to 30 in meantime, hands-on labs where the source code is all available coming from GitHub. So it won't be going away anytime soon. And even during the official AZ-400 training, a lot of the labs are actually based on that landing page. There's a specific DevOps at Microsoft subsection within the larger Microsoft doc, so more than a valid resource to go through. And as already mentioned, any other valuable resource, product group blogs, our own devblog.microsoft.com, where the Azure DevOps teams are blogging, the developer teams are blogging, the cloud advocates are blogging, up-to-date resources on YouTube or LinkedIn Learning or any other location where you can find content. And just to somehow set the scene and not giving you the wrong impressions, where does this C.E.R.T session help you? Most important, we have our exam objectives, and I'll show you in a minute what it refers to. And every exam objective is explained, touched on in about 10-15 minute sections. So we're going to try and keep it a little bit light. It's not going to be a full 90-minute session, although if you're obviously watching each and every exam objective section back to back, it's going to end up in about 70 to 90 minutes. It also should help you because, like, out of my own perspective, I'm an Azure technical trainer within Microsoft, helping customers and partners every single week out of our ESI program in delivering Microsoft courseware, helping them from a workshop perspective, helping them with real-life questions, and to be able to deliver those trainings. As a Azure technical trainer, we also need to be certified before delivering the training, which means that besides the technical background, I also have some insights on what it takes to take and pass a Microsoft exam if you've never done that before. I know it's a 60 to 90 minute session, depending a bit where we end up. And I would say I'm always been quite active in the Microsoft trainer community, in some more technical communities, was an MVP before I joined Microsoft. And I'm still, I would say, loyal back to the community. So if you're watching this session and you got any questions afterwards, again, feel free to reach out if you need that little push, if you need someone to mentor you, to coach you, and convincing you that taking the exam is actually a good thing. Again, feel free to reach out, petender@microsoft.com. And then, could be a little bit unfortunate, but there's obviously a good reason for it. We're not sharing real exam questions, mainly because as a trainer, we don't have access to the actual questions. That's a big reason, and that's why we cannot really help you with that. So it's all going to be official content. It's all going to be about what do I need to know for the exam. And once more, it starts with exam objectives. Now, where do the exam objectives come from? They're listed up on our landing page from Microsoft Learn within the certification topic AZ-400. And you can use a short link, aka.ms/AZ-400. AZ-400. So let's have a look what's over there. So this is the starting point, I would say, where maybe quite important since we're not January 27th yet. It's coming up in the next 2 weeks. But the exam objectives are slightly changing. Now, we only have a little bit of insights what's changing between the existing ones. And they've been around for about 6 months. So depending a little bit when you're going to take the exam, it might be that even the up-to-date session here is becoming a little bit outdated in the next coming weeks. But I wouldn't worry too much about it, and I'll show you why. So it starts with explaining what's the core content of the certification. Obviously, you can schedule the exam, but I assume you already know. If not, let me know. But what you can find here is, what do I need to know for my exam? So there's different exam objectives: developing the strategy, developing the site reliability strategy, developing security compliance, integrating source control, defining continuous integration, continuous delivery, and everything else that forms or builds up your DevOps mindset. So my recommendation is follow this exam objective document because it's changing every now and then. And for each and every of those larger exam objectives, we're going to identify what are the specifics you need to know. So just taking one example that's showing up here. Out of your instrumentation strategy, it means you need to know insights about enabling logging. You need to know how to capture telemetry out of your application and larger Azure runtime to obviously identify if there's any pipeline modification required. Do you need to publish more web apps? Do you need to move up to larger virtual machine sizes? And going back to your Azure templates, your source code, and pushing out those changes. So from here, try to familiarize yourself with the core objectives, the more detailed level objectives. And that's what you're going to find in the Microsoft Learn. It's what you're going to find in the hands-on labs. And that's mainly what I'm going to walk you through during this session as well. So let's start with the first objective. We got 7 of them, so that's why in total we do have 7 different sections if you want to watch the full recording, starting with overall DevOps strategy. So what it means, one of the options or one of the experiences you need to have is recommending a migration and consolidation into DevOps tools. So what it means is that out of DevOps, in general, we're literally trying to automate as much as possible. Where maybe before you've been using Azure templates, you've been using Azure command line scripts, Azure PowerShell scripts, using other tools like Chef, Puppet, allowing you to integrate configuration management. That's the scenario. If you come in from a developer side, you probably are familiar with like a dev and test environment, staging environment, production environment, where between those different environments, the different tools, you're going to define differences, which could be performance testing, running in a dev and test environment, moving it into Q&A before you're going to run it in a full production scenario. So that's where the first entry point comes in. We're not really changing our process. We're just going to migrate our existing components, which we call artifacts in the DevOps world, into our Azure DevOps strategy. So that's where, again, ARM templates are coming in, containers, which could be artifacts by itself, and moving into what we call source control, but more on that later on. Next to that, we also have everything around DevOps project management, allowing you to integrate testing management, outlining what is important from a testing perspective. We want to run functional testing, user testing, smoke testing is another terminology there. And finally, going into a service or a feature within Azure DevOps called Azure Boards, allowing you to build up work items. And from there, you're going to list up, these are all the tasks in my DevOps sequence. Developers need to do certain tasks. The operations team must complete certain tasks. And if all those tasks are not complete, we're not even allowing anything in a full production environment. So mapping it with some of the resources we have. So whenever you see any of those blue boxes coming up, there's short links behind them in the download location for the sessions themselves. We also have the actual PowerPoints available, so making it a little bit more easy for you to go back to those links. So as a wrap up for this first topic, you need to have some experience with Git, you need to have some experience with Azure DevOps repos, you need to know the high level of the Agile project management, integrating with third-party tools. It's one of the topics that will come back every now and then. It's overall sending feedback to your teams using Teams integration. There's a couple of Azure DevOps apps that you can integrate in Teams, in Slack if you don't want to use the Microsoft tooling, and the project management out of Azure DevOps boards. Next, you need to integrate an agile work management approach. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to become an expert on the agile way of working, but you need to be a little bit familiar with agile terminology. It's one of the development strategies or processes. Another one is Scrum, and obviously no surprises there. Azure DevOps supports the two different ones. So you need to have some experience in integrating your team members into the different locations, providing access permissions, following the different predefined agile scenarios and integrating them into your Azure DevOps world. That would be another one. Understanding terminology like cycle time, lead time, release time, and I'll talk about some details in the next couple of slides a little bit more, but that's the main idea. Where once more, reference to a couple of different locations in our Azure documentation that should help you moving forward on this specific objective. On to the next, where it's all about designing a quality strategy. Now, what does it mean to build a quality strategy within your average Azure DevOps world? It means that you first of all need to be able to identify quality metrics, which means how successful is my deployment? How many failures, how many successful ones do I have? But it also refers at deploying validated application code. So there is an instrument where you can integrate third-party plugins out of the Azure DevOps Marketplace, allowing you to perform source control, vulnerability scanning, or integrating it into your build process, where once your build process runs, which means that you're going to compile the source code, running it like a .NET build, or integrating with NuGet packages, would be the exact same thing for NPM applications, Node apps, integrating with NPM, Maven for Java apps or any other language you're using, where you want to make sure that the code you're using is up to date, no security vulnerabilities. So all those angles are coming back in this larger section called quality strategy, or recommending feature flags. What is a feature flag? It's literally a setting on or off that you can integrate into your application and exposing additional functionality to the users. If you think about like Windows 10 operating system, or even in Teams, you can enable preview features. That would be a feature flag. So it is part of the application source code. It's part of your compiled application, the one that your users are going to use. And based on the feature flag strategy or the context, you're going to enable or disable features. That's the main idea. And then optimizing quality testing. So back to the functional testing, user testing, and once more, some of those links that should help you in finding additional information for each and every of these topics. Once your quality is covered, we're going to move up and integrating our development process, and more specific, integrating security, which again means validating code, making sure that, for example, you don't have any secrets as part of your source code, like connection strings, specific app settings, Azure template credentials, connection strings in an ARM template, for example, could be another scenario where the recommendation is obviously to use Azure Key Vault as one of our key stores, secret stores, running as an Azure service. But that's not the only part. It also relates to validating infrastructure. The way to do that is, for example, integrating with Azure Policy, where once you run a pipeline and it's going to try and deploy something on the Azure platform, you could integrate release gates. It's a functionality within Azure Devops where it's going to validate the health state of your Azure environment, validating Azure policies. So an easy example, if you try to run a web app and, for example, SQL Azure deployment in West Europe region, but you do have an Azure policy in the backend that's blocking you from using West Europe, it means that the deployment will fail. So out of this DevOps concept where you try to optimize as much as possible, there is no point in running a pipeline if you already identify upfront that it's never going to succeed. And that's one of the mechanisms you can integrate. It also points at integrating the source code scanning again. And I'll talk about some examples later on in another exam objective. This is pretty high level overall DevOps strategy, and closing with overall recommendations around tools and practices. So there is an Azure DevOps security kit as an example, Sonar Cloud, Aqua Twistlock for container-based security scanning. That's one of the references we're looking for. Once the development cycle is complete, you need to know how to integrate it in your existing environment. Now, what does it mean? Integrating means we need to have, for example, the correct licenses. There's another section where I'll talk a little bit more about licensing, how it works. You need to know the end-to-end traceability from work item to working software. So that's literally going through the full DevOps cycle from the planning phase where the different teams are working together, establishing an architecture, moving it into actual build artifacts, creating Azure templates, Terraform templates, integrating with Chef, Puppet templates. And for the exam, don't worry too much about all those tools and third-party scenarios. You need to know that the tooling is there, but you don't need to be an expert on Terraform. You don't need to be an expert on Chef or Puppet. Integrating authentication access strategy, not towards your applications, but knowing how the identity model integrates with Azure DevOps, meaning that if you build an Azure DevOps organization, that's the highest level. Within the organization, you're going to create one or multiple projects. And obviously, you want to make sure that not just anyone can connect to your Azure DevOps environment, first of all, but maybe you also want to lock down that just anyone can connect to all different projects within your Azure DevOps organization. And there's a specific topic on the exam around identity, so it will come back a little bit later on. And then last, defining a strategy on how to integrate your on-prem environment together with public cloud resources. So Azure DevOps by itself is the DevOps tooling we use within Microsoft, or the product we offer out of Microsoft towards customers and partners. And it's available as a public cloud service. But if you want, you could also implement an Azure DevOps server in your on-prem environment, building out a collection of virtual machines to run the DevOps application. And besides that, also allowing you to run what we call build agents, where technically you're going to use virtual machines. So you need to know a little bit about what would be the decision point between running your DevOps tooling, the Azure DevOps server on-prem, or why should we move it into public cloud and using it as a SaaS-based solution. With some new links down here at the bottom of the slide, pointing towards conditional access, giving you more secured access to Azure DevOps out of Azure Active Directory. There's a link to documentation about how to manage users, groups, and membership within Azure DevOps, how to authenticate with personal access tokens. Other options is service connections, and I'll talk about those a little bit in another section, and some high-level view on Sec DevOps, DevSecOps, or DevOps. Sec is another terminology, all going back to the same high-level scenario. It's all about DevOps, all about the people, the process, delivering value, but this time also integrating security into the model. Good, we're moving on. And another exam objective is designing this quality strategy, where I talked a little bit about security, but another one is knowing how your deployments are going. Where in that little blue box, some interesting terminology that might be important to know for your exam is understanding the difference between the lead time, the process time, and in the end, activity ratio. Because if you look at implementing a DevOps strategy, it typically begins with an understanding of your existing processes. From there, you can evaluate what's working fine, what's not, and where do we need to adapt. So you could start with knowing your existing artifacts. What is the application language? What are the different packages we use? Are we looking into using containers, for example? What about testing? What is the detail or the level of detail we want for running our testing as part of the build process? What about our project management integration with the work items, the Scrum scenarios, the Agile scenarios, and how we're going to migrate from what we have into having our application lifecycle up and running? Now, if you look at your quality strategy, at least from this perspective, it means that you need to figure out like how much time am I spending on actually building the pipeline, but also building software updates, releasing them. And that would map with the total lead time. So that's really the time it takes for a feature or a full application, if you want, to land in our environment and being used by the customer or the user, the consumer. Process time is the time spent on a feature or again a full application that has value to the customer. And then obviously mapping the two with each other, you're going to build the ratio between the total lead time and the process time, and that's where your efficiency shows up. Where efficiency is expressed in a number or a percentage between 0 and 100, where typically it's more than 0. If it would be close to 0, it means it's not really optimized and you're not delivering quality, which probably means you're not delivering value to the business in the first place. It's typically also less than 100 because it would be like an ultimate achievement to have a full 100% rock solid DevOps strategy, which could be challenging by itself to achieve. Some additional details on the migration and consolidation topic as one of the other exam objectives. It's mainly pointing towards how can we migrate from a more traditional, maybe legacy if you want, scenario and migrating our content into an Azure DevOps environment. Now, for the ones who don't know, Azure DevOps is not really a new product. It's coming from Visual Studio Team Services. And before it was coming from Team Foundation Server, also abbreviated here as TFS. And a lot of our customers are still using TFS. A lot of them are obviously in meantime migrated to Visual Studio Team Services. And the idea is that we still support customers migrating away from the legacy systems into Azure DevOps. Besides that, also knowing what Azure Artifacts is about. And an Azure Artifact is reflecting what you would see in, for example, Visual Studio or Eclipse or any other development environment where you're going to manage packages. So what you can do with Azure Artifacts is, instead of allowing each and every developer to reach out to NuGet.org and downloading application packages from there, is now centralizing them in Azure Artifacts package feed and pointing the developer or the Visual Studio or overall development environment to this managed, locked down, limited Azure Artifacts package feed. Now, what makes it limited and locked down? It's where you as an organization are going to define what packages can be used, what versions of packages can be used, and all of that to work towards a centralized overall strategy, which is going to help you in another DevOps terminology called technical depth, making sure that all the developers are using the same version of packages, also helping you in only using trustworthy packages, knowing that there's no code vulnerabilities and so on. That's the main objective. Briefly talked already about feature flag, and a little bit more in-depth is where you need to know how you can integrate feature flags into your DevOps lifecycle and how it can help you in publishing your applications. So a couple of words here. You need to know the difference between a ring and a stage. You need to know how to capture the usage of feature flags using telemetry out of Azure. Could be Azure Application Insights, allowing you to really trace down all the metrics from within your application landscape. What is the difference between a ring and a stage? An easy example that I guess most of you are familiar with is that if you look at like Windows 10 operating system, we have different release cycles where you have the long-term strategy, the major builds typically coming out in April and somewhere October timeframe. And in between, at least if you sign up for Windows Insider Preview, that could be seen as a different ring. So helping you to release software, to release applications, different iterations of the deployments, different iterations like exposing different versions. And a feature flag could be as easy as I'm downloading full official Windows 10 license, I'm running it, and I'm gonna opt in for the Windows preview, which means that instead of receiving updates only every couple of months, you could now move back to alpha or beta versions. Early adopter, canary build are other synonyms for that, where you can help Microsoft in testing new features. And that's all what feature flags is all about. We're almost there for this first exam objective. I know it's quite a lot, and again, just trying to help you in understanding like all the different topics you need to know about for the exam, where the next one is the Agile work management process. Now, again, the idea is not that we're gonna move you into becoming Agile certified, but what it means is that you need to know the notions of, if as an organization we start using Azure DevOps, how can I integrate my work process into the tooling? So Azure DevOps, as already mentioned, supports different work management scenarios. Out of the box, we provide you basic. Let me take one step back, where basic allows you to create what we call epics, issues, and tasks. A task is typically anything that a developer, a system engineer, a project manager would work on. An issue is obviously when something goes wrong, and typically leading up into a task, like there is a problem, we find out that we have secrets inside source code, so we need to move it out, and the action to move it out could be a task. If you look at the Agile project or development approach, it's giving you some additional, more granular options than basic, where we still have an epic, but we also recognize a feature. So we can create a specific Agile defined item, allowing us to identify features that in return we're gonna hook into our feature flag coding process. We still have tasks, but we can now also configure bugs if that's what you wanna list up. And if you got any bug tracking, you want some tracing about anything that's not working as it should be, that's where we're going to create an issue. Then the Scrum methodology is a lot aligned with the Agile way of working, using similar terminology, so just know that it's there. And then last, typically used for larger organizations, the more complex structure, they also going to integrate the issue, change, and risk management. And that's a methodology that we describe as Capability Maturity Model Integration, or CMMI. So for the exam, it could be important to know the difference between Basic, Agile, Scrum, and CMMI. So some terminology, the cycle time, lead time, what I already talked about earlier, Kanban boards or Azure boards allowing you to literally map out your project management, know what a sprint is about. What is a sprint? It's some kind of deadline based on tasks. So you could come up with all the different tasks related to this project, to this application, should be finished by June 1st, where June 1st would be a sprint. And if you have any tasks or bugs coming up in between that sprint time window, they could be moved into a backlog. So it's not really possible, although I never really looked into if it's technically possible, but out of the overall project methodology, the idea is that if any tasks or issues or bugs are missing a sprint, that they get moved into a backlog. And you're not going to move out the date of the sprint itself. Some insights on the quality, but it's mainly mapping some tooling. So at the beginning of the session, I talked about optimizing overall DevOps quality, which means you need to know some insights about application testing, user testing. Out of the Azure DevOps Marketplace, some names here is Selenium, Appium, Xamarin, user testing. Visual Studio is also one of the available options for like a individual developer, but we're not really asking any questions. Apparently on the exam, it's not showing up on the exam objectives anymore. Supporting code coverage, so validating, security scanning, those kind of integrations, depending a bit on the development language, it could be coverage for Python, it could be Java Cocoa, it could be Bullseye for C and C++. SonarQube is another third-party product helping you in recognizing the source code vulnerabilities, identifying any outdated packages that you might use out of Azure Artifacts, or identifying suspicious, again, vulnerabilities. Integrating some lint tool, like if you're working with PowerShell scripts and you want to validate the syntax, you could run PowerShell lint, JavaScript lint, so a couple of different tools. And once more, you don't need to become an expert on all those third-party tools, but just knowing that the tools are there and high level why you should use one tool or the other. And last example here, performance testing, where you could use the JMeter example for Java apps. You could use Load Runner, simulating load testing and figuring out how your application could be impacted by it. And then once more, you already know in the dark blue boxes, links to feature flag documentation in this case, and pointing you towards Azure DevOps Labs that we have online, where you can deploy an Azure DevOps pipeline integrating technical depth validation using SonarQube or Sonar Cloud, because we offer two different labs. Last part is security validation, where again we talked about Sec DevOps, DevSecOps. DevOps Sec is another one, but most important, it's three different teams working together end to end. So bringing in source code validation, that's for example what a tool like White Source Bolt is doing. Running licensing optimization if you're using open source integration into your applications, like the Apache open source model. It doesn't always mean that you can just go out and use that package into your applications. So that's what white source is going to validate. The Azure Devops Secure DevOps Kit is another example. Some pointers towards documentation around Sec DevOps. What does it mean? Where do I need to, what do I need to take into account? That would be the idea. Or another tool, OWASP, from the OWASP org, is allowing you to run penetration testing, typically driven out of a Docker container that has all the OWASP integration, and similar to White Source Vault, similar to SonarQube, Sonar Cloud tools, you would integrate that into your build pipeline concept, making sure that whenever your build pipeline is creating an artifact, that it goes through all those scanning and detection mechanisms. One last topic is around licensing, at least the last topic in this first section, still building out your DevOps strategy, is understanding Azure DevOps licensing. Now there's a lot more than what I can show here in this one single slide. In the bottom right corner, a pointer towards pricing and licensing URL for Azure DevOps. But in short, it means that we have a lot of different models. You have the free Azure pipelines allowing you to run build and release pipelines, integrating with Azure Artifacts. And if you don't consume that much space, you actually don't need to pay for it. But in a full, more professional scenario, you can move up to additional functionality, where you have a basic plan allowing you to start paying for each and every individual Azure DevOps user. Whenever they get integration, they start using Azure pipelines, Azure boards, Azure repos, or Azure Artifacts, it means they need a license. And then in larger organizations, we probably offer some bundled licensing as well. So the recommendation is check back in that pricing and licensing option. There's a ambulance passing by, but should be okay for now. And I should remember that I need to move this out of the recording. Then a little bit on authentication access strategy. Already talked about it at the beginning of this section. Once more, 2 pointers to some additional documentation. What's important, knowing that Azure DevOps supports on-prem Active Directory, supports Azure Active Directory, and supports Microsoft Live ID, Microsoft account to authenticate and identify yourself. If you want to integrate with other applications outside of Azure DevOps, think of Visual Studio, think of VS Code or any other development environment. You're typically going to use personal access tokens, maybe using Service Principal if you want to integrate with an Azure environment. That would be the idea. Within your Azure DevOps environment, you have the DevOps organization. That's the highest level. Within the organization, you're going to identify the different Azure DevOps projects. And on each level, you can define the built-in security groups, who can do what within my DevOps environment. What are the permissions, where some of them are configurable and tunable? And that's mainly what this sub-objective is talking about. So with that, let me wrap up this first session and showing you like a sample practice question that could show up in a similar way on the exam. So your company is developing a Node.js application. The application requires the installation and publishing of NPM packages. You need to configure the NPM install and publish steps. What should you configure? Where you can choose between 4 possible options. A lot of the questions on the exam will be multiple choice. Typically 4, but it could be like 6 or 8 as well. So what you need is trying to identify the specific question, trying to map it with any of the 4 options. So in this scenario, the key question is, what do you need to configure? On line 3, it says you need to configure npm install and publish steps. Is that something you would do out of Visual Studio App Center? Would you use Azure Pipelines? Would you use Azure Artifacts? Or would you use Azure Repos? The correct answer here is Azure Pipelines. Why Azure Pipelines? Because that's the instrument within Azure DevOps allowing you to run an NPM task, which enables installation and publishing of the package itself. So the confusing part, if I take one step back, is Azure Artifacts. You could be getting confused a little bit because we're talking about NPM packages, where you could go like, well, it's something about NPM install, publish, but that's not what Azure Artifacts is doing. It's allowing you to integrate NPM packages, but it's not really installing or publishing them. Azure Repos is where we talk about source control, and using NPM packages is not really going back to the source control itself. And Visual Studio App Center is what we're going to use to publish, but not integrating in this way because it's not really Azure DevOps related, or not per se. And with that, we're at the end of this first exam objective topic, where in a nutshell, I talked about understanding overall DevOps concepts. You should be able to recognize third-party tools without being an expert on each and one of them, and knowing where they can help. You need to know the value stream maps, where again it points at how valuable is this Azure DevOps process for my business, knowing the process time, the lead time, the release time, and knowing the details about cost and licensing. So with that, I would like to thank you for being here in this first session. There's more sessions coming up. And again, feel free to reach out, stay in touch whenever you get any questions or when you take the exam and you want to tell me that this C.E.R.T prep session actually helped you. Don't hesitate reaching out, petender@microsoft.com. Wishing you a nice rest of the day.